Well, I have to say, I scarcely know where to begin with Peter Hitchens this week. Peter, very good morning to you.
Morning.
Well, how absolutely and utterly idiotic and useless can a government be?
Oh, much, much worse than this one. You wait and see. But this is not really about government. This is about the huge gap between the propaganda which the government has spread and what it really believes. You saw in the case of Professor Ferguson, you saw in the case of Dominic Cummings' wild ride to Barnard Castle, and you see in this the simple fact these people never believed their own propaganda. At the time they did these things, they were supposed to be not doing them because we were faced with a terrifying disease which spread with incredible rapidity, and therefore you simply couldn't do certain things. It was that serious. And yet all these people did things which didn't fit in with the rules which they had imposed, Mr. Hancock personally imposed, by decrees signed in his own name on the population. That's the first thing to remember. The second is the bizarre state of British politics and public opinion. Here is a man who, over 15 months, has crashed the economy, strangled huge numbers of businesses, ended thousands of jobs, whose holders probably don't yet know they've gone, reduced us to the most incredible levels of debt, condemned us to years of high inflation and punitive taxation, wrecked the education of hundreds of thousands of school children and students, destroyed the lives of many old people who were deprived entirely of social contact. All these things, and he remains in office and is largely treated as if he was a competent person. But he canoodles with the colleague in the anteroom to his ministerial office, and gosh, this is all terrible. He has to go. On the other hand, although it's terrible, it's not terrible because he has betrayed his wife and 3 children, or she has betrayed her husband and 3 children. These are things which we no longer care about because we're way beyond that kind of thing. We're much too grown up to do so.
Exactly.
It's because she's broken social distancing rules. That is the state of this country. People. It's the fascinating thing is as always, not what's against the rules, but what's allowed under the rules. He could have done all those things, provided he hadn't done a canoodle in sight of a CCTV camera installed in his own office, apparently without his knowledge. He would still be there.
Well, it's interesting you say that. I like you, I think the public are no longer bothered by adultery or adulterous
Some of the
politicians.
public are.
No one cares about that. I think
some of the public are.
No, I think it genuinely wasn't about that. I mean, it was a particularly cringy clinch that he involved himself in, which was certainly, if he was on Strictly Come Dancing, you would have thrown him off immediately. But the thing is that I think it was the hypocrisy that he showed because he had been such a hardliner and he had caused so many people distress and he had made people pay fines for things that were less bad than what he was doing. And so I think that was what got him in the end.
Well, maybe so, but I still say that it was his pursuit of a largely crazy and damaging policy, which is the reason why he ought to be out of office and the reason why the people of this country should have been in a state of huge discontent for many, many months. But that's what it takes. You also, of course, have a problem in what would once have been a sexual scandal with a prime minister who can't conceivably sack any minister for doing that. So it was really left up to him whether he went or not, because Mr. Johnson couldn't possibly have said to him, look, Matt Hancock, you've been behaving fast and loose with your missus, you've got to go.
Well, that would be inconceivable. But what I find also quite amusing, Peter, as I'm sure you do, is those who support Boris Johnson and this Prime Minister and his government who say, well, one of the great things about Boris is that he's very loyal. I mean, nearly fell off the chair. Really? Loyal to whom?
Well, he's very loyal to the people who put him into office. And the continued tenure of the Education Secretary, for instance, whose name I can never remember. But his continued tenure of his... is tribute to the fact that he played such an important part in the extraordinary operations to make Mr. Johnson leader of the Conservative Party and so Prime Minister. And the people who helped him with that are still very much people who he will be loyal to, because that is the basis of Johnsonian politics. As long as you stick close to the dear leader, then you're okay.
Well, that's true. But sadly, again, and you've said this many times before, the sort of the chipping away of the credibility of this government continues apace. At what point, if there ever will come this point, does the edifice start to crumble?
Well, the problem, of course, for this government is the incredibility of the opposition,
Yeah.
which has really ceased to function as one and given up the whole idea of being an opposition and spent, again, a lot of the past 15 months going along with the government and demanding the government did things even more stupidly. It's like the old joke about coffee, isn't it? Do stupid things more quickly and more often if you drink a lot of coffee. Well, the only opposition we got from Keir Starmer was do stupid things to the country more often and more quickly.
Right.
Well, that's not opposition. And in any case, the whole point of New Labour has been taken over by the Conservative Party, which is now the New Labour Party. So what is it they do? Though I have to say that I do think that the Chesham and Amersham by-election might have been a grave warning. If other parties apart from Labour could put together a new left-wing coalition on whatever basis, this government is extremely vulnerable to that. And it is particularly vulnerable because its policy on development is extraordinarily damaging to very large numbers of its own voters in the suburbs and the countryside. Yes. And they felt they had nowhere to turn until Chesham and Amersham. And suddenly they realised that they could, in fact, unseat Tory MPs if they felt like it.
Yes. Well, funnily enough,
one of those clouds as small as a man's hand, which will grow and grow. I think we need to worry about that.
Yeah. Well, since you said that last week, actually, I've spoken to a few Tory MPs, and some of them privately, some of them publicly, have said that they believe that an awful lot of the Tory voters in that part of the world just decided not to vote because they couldn't bring themselves to do it.
Well, there's your problem, isn't it? But then again, if Labour begins to crumble, and my great fear is that the Green Party will replace it, without all the drawbacks of Keir Starmer and the Labour Party, without all the pretense of being a working class party, which Labour hasn't been for years, but has relied on pretending to be. And if a new left-wing coalition, similar to the one that's forming in Germany, based upon green dogma, begins to form, then I think the idea that the Tories have got the country in their grip for decades to come will turn out not to be true. But to me, this is all surface because nothing will actually be done about any of the really big problems which face the country because nobody will address that.
No. Well, you wrote about that this weekend. I wanted to touch upon that because I, like you, remember the heady days of BT, pre-BT, when you had to get your phone from the post office and you had to wait sometimes for months and months on end. But you're pointing out that some of the so-called sort of privatisations and some of the advances, if you like, in some of Britain's kind of commercial enterprises have not been entirely successful.
Well, the BT business was because people would say, well, let's say what you like about Margaret Thatcher, but the telephones are better.
Yeah.
And BT is better than the old post office telephones, which we used to have. Well, I don't think that's true. I think that I hear people cursing BT all the time, far more than I ever heard them cursing the old post office telephones. It's the idea that privatisation was itself a miraculous thing. Anybody who travels by train knows that that's not true. What happened with privatisation was the creation of a whole lot of monopolies who were even more irresponsible, untouchable, and unresponsive to their customers than the old nationalised industries. And in many cases are owned abroad. I know that water companies, they ended up being owned by an Australian bank.
Yes.
In many cases. So I don't see how that benefited us. And most of the other supposed achievements of Thatcherism seem to me to have come pretty much to nothing. I just think she's immensely overrated and wasn't really in any serious way conservative, particularly over what to me has always been the most important issue of pretty much of our time, the education of the children of this country, where she gave in to the campaign to destroy grammar schools. Whatever you think of comprehensive schools, there isn't any question that selective state grammar schools were better and they were more accessible to the poor. And she took part in the destruction of these irreplaceable institutions. It's the most crazy bit of destruction by any government since the dissolution of the monasteries. And to claim to be a conservative when you allowed that to happen just seems to me to be impossible.
Yes.
I think there were a lot of things about that were admirable personally. Her own life is an extraordinary story, but I do not think that politically she was a success.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because obviously it was a different time, and I think had she not done those things, then we would not be perhaps any better off if they were still here for example, if we had not made BT into the big sort of commercial operation that it is, it may not be run very well, and that may be partly the government of the day's fault that it's not run very well. It may well be that we shouldn't have sold off large portions of the train companies and the power companies abroad, but that's happened. I'm not sure that we would have been better off just keeping one huge nationalised industry either, though, because if you look at the NHS, for example, one of the problems with the NHS is that it hasn't ever modernised. It's always been run by the same management structures and the same people and the same types of systems that it always was run by, which makes it incredibly inefficient.
Well, I'm not sure about that either. I think the sort of marketisation of these things under Mrs. Thatcher, I think, made them less efficient than they were. Actually, in terms of the result and expenditure, the British NHS, while far from perfect, outperforms American private health by a long way. It may not be the best model, but I think one of the things which made it immensely worse was the ceaseless restructuring and, say, marketisation of it, which began under the Thatcher government. I don't actually think that nationalisation of some things is particularly bad. And for goodness sake, the post office was nationalised, I think, by Henry VIII. It's not an ideological thing. The Royal Navy was nationalised about the same time, and it couldn't function any other way. Some things are better run by the state. But I think the thing which really has to be counted against the Thatcher government is that its economic policies did destroy an enormous amount of manufacturing industry. And the fashionable economic nostrum at the time was, oh, that doesn't matter, you don't need manufacturing, you can run an economy on services. Well, now the mood has changed, and people now say, well, actually, you have to have manufacturing, but we haven't got it. And in destroying manufacturing, you destroy people's ways of life.
Yes. No, I think that's true.
Right part of the country, people simply had their way of life destroyed and replaced by more or less nothing. And I think that was a disaster, and I don't think anybody really ought to defend it. The other thing, remember the miners' strike, what do you think about Arthur Scargill? The behaviour of the Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire miners who would not go out on strike on his orders was extremely brave and often physically brave, because people came down and tried to picket them.
Yeah.
Their reward from the Conservative Party, lifetime unemployment.
Yes. But there again, I mean, you wouldn't really want people
to pay a debt.
But there again, Peter, you wouldn't really want people going down mines in this day and age, would you?
Oh yes, I would. I think that the people, certainly they do in China all the time. You make it as safe as you possibly can, but it's not. I would rather have this country producing a large part of its own energy than being dependent on others for it. And I think that the large parts of this country, in the north and in South Wales, depended heavily for their community life on the existence of that industry. If you're going to destroy it, then you have to have some idea as to what you replace it with. Nobody thought about that.
No.
And the social consequences of the destruction of the mining communities have been catastrophic. You have to think about more than just money when you're running a country. And I have the feeling I got in the Thatcher era, increasingly, which is what eventually cheesed me off against it, was that actually money was the only thing they were thinking.
But the trouble is, of course, that we've had short-termist governments now for such a long time that I've forgotten what it's like to have one that was planning for the future. And in fact, the last one probably that was planning for the future is the future that you despise, which is the Blair government, who were very sure that they were putting in sort of various planks that would affect the British people and the British culture and the British country for decades to come. But hold that thought, because I've got a great story to tell you in a moment. I was talking to somebody at the weekend, Peter, who told me something very interesting about land in this country. And do you know that there's an epidemic right now going on of farmers who are apparently selling their fields for the use of solar panelling, so that they get two benefits out of it. They can put money into it, but they then supposedly loan the money to the people who put the solar panels in, thereby collecting interest on the revenue that they put in. So if they've got cash, farmers will do it. They can also still graze sheep, apparently, under that. But here's the trick. Apparently, after 10 years, the greenfield site that was the place where the solar panels were put is designated to be a brownfield site, and they can then sell it for development.
That would explain how very much of this you now see as you travel around the country. There's been an awful lot more of it in the past few years. Certainly the last bit explains it absolutely. Once agricultural land becomes saleable for development, it enormously increases the price.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm much intrigued to know it, but not wholly surprised.
No.
When we see these things happening, think there must be some reason why this is going on.
Yes.
Some subsidy of some kind, because it's not actually rational to put solar panels
No,
up in the country.
it makes no sense. And apparently, if you keep them there for 10 years is the period for which you have to keep them there, and then it becomes a brownfield site which you can develop.
Yeah, well, that's it. That is the most astonishing thing. Because the sale of agricultural land for development is normally very difficult, and it keeps the price of that land down, but it must push it up. I foresee when people actually begin to realise just how much concrete is going to be spread particularly over the south of this country in the next few years. I think there is a big problem, as we were discussing earlier, for the Conservative Party waiting.
Yes, I think so. The other thing I was told is that all of these kind of new build houses where they have sort of thousands of houses going up, apparently the law says that they have to be subjected to various planning decisions and planning permissions if there's more than 2,500 being built in any one place. But of course what they do is they parcel them up into parcels of 500 apiece to various different companies, and then they don't have to worry about the planning permission.
No, it's extraordinary how easy it is if you have the right lawyers to evade what appear to be fierce law. I was just out on my bike outside Oxford a couple of weeks ago. I noticed a lot of posters in the hedges saying "Don't vote for concrete councillors." It's a term that's apparently spreading. It did the Tories, I think, quite a bit of damage in the area around Oxford at the last local elections. They are associated with concreting over the country, and people who move to the country or indeed to pleasant suburbs and see their peace and seclusion under threat will not likely forgive those who did it to them. It's just a question of where they will turn when the moment comes.
Well, exactly right. And speaking of being out on your bike, I suppose you would have seen at the weekend the e-scooter casualty rates in London have soared, apparently, by 570%.
Well, this is a Mail on Sunday story.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, of course. I mean, but if you look at, I spent some time last week looking at the House of Commons Transport Committee's so-called report on e-scooters. A lot of the information in it comes straight from the e-scooter manufacturers. I didn't get the impression that a really proper, impartial examination had taken place here, partly because there is so little information, apart from the PR claims of the e-scooter manufacturers. This constant claim, for instance, which is swallowed by ministers without a second thought, that if you have lots of e-scooters, people will stop using their cars. There's no evidence of this at all. All common sense goes against it. A car is a steel box. It has side impact protection. It has airbags. It has seatbelts. It has anti-lock braking. A scooter is just a piece of metal hurtling along the road at speeds, as far as one can see, up to 70 miles an hour, and certainly up to 40. And why anybody would swap the safety of a car for that? I mean, again, the problem comes down to licensing. You can ride these things with a provisional license, for which you need to pass no test, and therefore they appeal to people who can't be bothered to pass tests, or maybe have had their licenses taken away, and that will be the problem. And no doubt that's one of the reasons why the casualties.
Yeah, and I mean, if you live in California, where the weather is pretty much the same all the year round, that's one thing. But I mean, you wouldn't want to be on one today, would you?
Well, no, that is another reason why they're unlikely to appeal to car drivers. They're not practical transport for people doing things like trying to go to work or anything like that. They're frivolous transport for people trying to get home after drinking too much, and also, of course, they are ideal transport for people who want to snatch handbags and mug people and then zoom off, because they can carry two people. And they do in many of the places where these experiments are going underway. You can commit a crime and then zoom off, vanish down a side alley without any possibility of anybody ever catching you. There couldn't have been a vehicle ever designed more suitable either for a mugger or for a drug.
Well, I saw something really disturbing actually on Friday night. I was out, believe it or not, at a party which was held that I went to. Strangely, it was on a boat.
I hope you're all socially distanced.
Oh, of course, absolutely right. Well, actually, we were all canoodling, given what Matt Hancock had been up to. But I was going home in a taxi, and I came upon two guys on these electric scooters wearing, those hockey masks from the horror films. And I just thought to myself, what on earth are they doing? Because it didn't look very pleasant to me. No,
well, I wouldn't be a bit surprised if your suspicions and mine turned out to be correct on that. There it is, silent. You slip up behind people from without any warning at all. Do what you want, and then you're off.
And if you're wearing a mask, nobody knows who you are.
One guy does the driving, the other one stands by.
Right. Shocking stuff. Great to talk to you, Peter, as ever. We'll catch up again next week when we may have more discussions about the new Secretary of State for Health.